Spring. Frog ran up the path to Toad's house. He knocked on the front door. There was no answer. "Toad! Toad!" shouted Frog. "Wake up! It is spring!" "Blah!" said a voice from inside the house. "Toad! Toad!" cried Frog. "The sun is shining! The snow is melting! Wake up!" "I am not here," said the voice. Frog walked into the house. It was dark. All the shutters were closed. "Toad, where are you?" called Frog. "Go away," said the voice from a corner of the room. Toad was lying in bed. He had pulled all the covers over his head. Frog pushed Toad out of bed. He pushed him out of the house and onto the front porch. Toad blinked in the bright sun. "Help," said Toad. "I cannot see anything." "Don't be silly," said Frog. "What you see is the clear, warm light of April, and it means that we can begin a whole new year together, Toad. Think of it," said Frog. "We will skip through the meadows and run through the woods and swim in the river. In the evenings we will sit right here on this front porch and count the stars." "You can count them, Frog," said Toad. "I will be too tired. I am going back to bed." Toad went back into the house. He got into the bed and pulled the covers over his head again. "But Toad," cried Frog, "you will miss all the fun." "Listen, Frog," said Toad. "How long have I been asleep?" "You have been asleep since November," said Frog. "Well then," said Toad, "a little more sleep will not hurt me. Come back again and wake me up at about past May. Good night, Frog." "But Toad," said Frog, "I will be lonely until then." Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. Frog looked at Toad's calendar. The November page was still on top. Frog tore off the November page. He tore off the December page, and the January page, the February page, and the March page. He came to the April page. Frog tore off the April page too. Then Frog ran back to Toad's bed. "Toad, Toad, wake up! It is May now." "What?" said Toad. "Can it be May so soon?" "Yes," said Frog. "Look at your calendar." Toad looked at the calendar. The May page was on top. "Why, it is May," said Toad as he climbed out of bed. Then he and Frog ran outside to see how the world was looking in the spring. So, this is the first Frog and Toad story that Arnold Lobel ever published. In 1970, it was released as part of a collection called Frog and Toad Are Friends. Today, it's also the first story in Frog and Toad The Complete Collection, published in 2016. You're likely familiar with the Frog and Toad books and almost certainly read them as a child. The books are some of the most famous in the 4 to 8 age range. I know I personally have fond memories of my kindergarten teacher reading these stories to me, and you likely have similar memories. This story, Spring, is notable for many reasons. Frog and Toad are often relatable and sometimes aspirational characters. And does it get more relatable than just wanting to stay in bed? But beyond just general sleepiness, it's also easy to read Toad as depressed in this story. I know when I faced certain bouts of depression, the only thing I wanted to do was stay in bed. But what really strikes me about the story is how Frog can simply trick Toad into thinking it's May, and there are seemingly no repercussions for doing so. Can you imagine that? If you were living 1 month ahead of the actual month, can you picture all the ways that would upend your life? Yet for Frog and Toad, it's seemingly not a problem. There's this sense of timelessness in Frog and Toad's world. In another story, Christmas Eve, we see that Toad lives such a life that he can afford to live with a broken clock. Can you even imagine? I can't. My life would crumble if I didn't have a way to tell time. But for Toad, that's apparently just how he operates on the day-to-day. Another story, titled A List, further supports this sense of low-pressure living. On Toad's list of things to do today, he writes, wake up, eat breakfast, get dressed, go to Frog's house, take walk with Frog, eat lunch, take nap, play games with Frog, eat supper, and go to sleep. None of these items is particularly pressing, and none of them come with an attached time. Basically, Toad can do these things whenever he feels like it. This is part of what I mean when I say Frog and Toad are aspirational characters. They get to simply be together every day and enjoy life at their own pace. In the grand scheme of things, a day is just a day. That's hard for us to understand since every minute of every day is valuable to us as human beings living in a commerce-driven society. We're told to make the most of our time, often through labor and wealth accumulation. Meanwhile, Frog and Toad make the most of their time by being together and enjoying the bounty of nature. And when you think about it literally, this kind of makes sense. Frog and Toad are literally animals. Sure, they wear clothes and stand on 2 feet, but ultimately they're animals living in an animal world. They don't have a 9 to 5. They don't have a daily schedule. They just get to take each day as it comes and pass the time however they want. I can't help but be envious. Who wouldn't want to hibernate for a while and enjoy spring when it comes? There's a lot we can learn about living from the animals, which is exactly why people keep pets, like frogs and toads for example. As a fun fact, when writing, Arnold Lobel drew on childhood memories like summers in Vermont, where he could take frogs and toads as pets. There are other things worth pointing out about this story. For one, as a former English major, I can't help but note how Toad's emergence from his home is reminiscent of Plato's allegory of the cave. In the dialogue, Socrates posits that if someone escaped from the cave, they would immediately turn and re-enter the cave. The sun would hurt a cave dweller's eyes, and the real world might frighten a cave dweller to such an extent that they would simply retreat to the comfortable world they already know. Socrates also posited that if an escaped cave dweller tried to free his fellow cave dwellers, the others would still reject the outside world, just as we see between Frog and Toad. I don't think this was necessarily an intended allusion, but I think it's cool that we can draw the comparison. Ultimately, I pull a couple of messages from this story. For one, it's good to have someone who can help you do the right thing. Moreover, sometimes we have to trick ourselves into doing the right thing. Whatever method propels us to self-care, it's worth it. And ultimately, we don't know what happens next. Maybe Frog tells Toad that he tricked him, and maybe Toad is okay with that. Or maybe Toad goes on believing he's a month ahead and comes to wake up again in April of next year on the true date. But whatever happens, Frog and Toad are clearly happy and living their best lives. If you've watched my videos for a while, you know that I love returning to children's literature to see how I think about the writing and storytelling as an adult. The same is true for Frog and Toad, a book series whose details largely slipped from my mind as I grew older. Today, I want to take you through some of the big ideas I noticed in the complete collection. We just touched on the view of time from an animal's perspective. Now let's take a look at metafiction, selflessness, and insecurity. For the uninitiated, metafiction is generally defined as a story that alludes to its status as a story, but it can be broader than that. If a story is about storytelling, we could call that a work of metafiction. In my opinion, all stories or poems are at least partially self-referential, but quite a few Frog and Toad stories explicitly emphasize the art of storytelling. Here's the second story in the collection, aptly titled The Story. One day in summer, Frog was not feeling well. Toad said, "Frog, you are looking quite green." "But I always look green," said Frog. "I am a frog." "Today you look very green, even for a frog," said Toad. "Get into my bed and rest." Toad made Frog a cup of hot tea. Frog drank the tea, and then he said, "Tell me a story while I am resting." "All right," said Toad. "Let me think of a story to tell you." Toad thought and thought, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. "I will go out on the front porch and walk up and down," said Toad. "Perhaps that will help me to think of a story." Toad walked up and down on the porch for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad went into the house and stood on his head. "Why are you standing on your head?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I stand on my head it will help me to think of a story," said Toad. Toad stood on his head for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad poured a glass of water over his head. "Why are you pouring water over your head?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I pour water over my head it will help me to think of a story," said Toad. Toad poured many glasses of water over his head, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad began to bang his head against the wall. "Why are you banging your head against the wall?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I bang my head against the wall hard enough, it will help me to think of a story," said Toad. "I am feeling much better now, Toad," said Frog. "I do not think I need a story anymore." "Then you get out of bed and let me get into it," said Toad. "Because now I feel terrible," Frog said. "Would you like me to tell you a story, Toad?" "Yes," said Toad, "if you know one." "Once upon a time," said Frog, "there were two good friends, a frog and a toad. The frog was not feeling well. He asked his friend the toad to tell him a story. The toad could not think of a story. He walked up and down on the porch, but he could not think of a story. He stood on his head, but he could not think of a story. He poured water over his head, but he could not think of a story. He banged his head against the wall, but he could not think of a story. Then the toad did not feel so well, and the frog was feeling better. So the toad went to bed, and the frog got up and told him a story. The end. "How was that, Toad?" said Frog. But Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. This story honestly creates so many thoughts inside my head as a reader and a writer. To me, the story seems like a clear illustration of writer's block and provides one of the best cures for writer's block I've ever heard. Just last semester, my advisor told me that when you're stuck, you take an event from your real life and write it exactly as you remember it. That's exactly what Frog did here when Toad was desperate for a story. He drew on real life. The recitation of the story within the story also creates this sort of interesting infinite loop. In coding, an infinite loop is a set of instructions that have no functional exit, so they repeat indefinitely. In this story, we get the story within a story, which theoretically also has the story within that story, and so on until infinity. I don't entirely know what to make of it. You can, of course, say I'm reading too much into it, which is fine, but it's interesting to evaluate the ideas of narration, objective storytelling, and also oral storytelling. To paraphrase Joy Harjo, all writing has its roots in oral storytelling. But beyond that, people who are much smarter than I am have studied the link between oral storytelling and children's books. Think about it, you likely had children's books read to you orally before you could read them for yourself. Maybe Frog and Toad stories were among those. There's an intimacy in oral storytelling, an intimacy that we see here between Frog and Toad. We see how seriously Toad takes the task of coming up with a tale to tell his friend. Also, one more thing to note. Oftentimes writers will say that it's a sin to tell the audience something they already know. Here we get the entire story for a second time, but somehow it works. You could argue that the story commits this sin since it's intended for a younger reader anyway, who might not remember details very well. But I honestly think that's giving younger readers far too little credit. I think it's the story's exploration of storytelling that makes the sin forgivable here. But let's keep things moving. The next story with a metafiction angle is called Dragons and Giants, originally from the book Frog and Toad Together. I'm going to do a bit of paraphrasing as I read this one. Frog and Toad were reading a book together. "The people in this book are brave," said Toad. "They fight dragons and giants, and they are never afraid." "I wonder if we are brave," said Frog. Frog and Toad looked into a mirror. "We look brave," said Frog. "Yes, but are we?" asked Toad. From there, Frog and Toad go outside and climb a mountain. They confront a hungry snake, a rock slide, and a flying hawk. Each time they either shout, "I am not afraid," or "We are not afraid," and eventually run back to Toad's house. The text picks up. Frog, "I am glad to have a brave friend like you," said Toad. He jumped into the bed and pulled the covers over his head. "And I am happy to know a brave person like you, Toad," said Frog. He jumped into the wardrobe and shut the door. Toad stayed in bed and Frog stayed in the wardrobe. They stayed there for a long time, just feeling very brave together. Now, on the one hand, this ending is kind of funny, but on the other hand, I don't think we're entirely meant to take it as a joke. Let's not kid ourselves, Frog and Toad were very brave. They confronted a lot of scary things. This is a moral that's been done to death, but it's still important for children nonetheless. Bravery is not the absence of fear, it's choosing to stand in the face of fear. As someone who's never been very brave myself, I like this story. It resonates with me. When I was younger, I always tried to face my fears, but it rarely worked. I often retreated to the bed or to the closet. But part of the story's message is that it's easier to be brave when you've got someone by your side. Another message is that it's okay to be scared. Frog and Toad perhaps aren't all that brave, not in the same way that people in fairy tales are brave. But that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. I appreciate that Frog and Toad don't fall into masculine stereotypes. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being masculine either. Men should be able to perform their gender however they want to. But this story teaches us that it's okay not to be a Prince Charming type, and I think that's super valuable to young male readers especially. Frog and Toad are still aspirational, despite not being traditionally brave or macho. They run from things that might harm them, and again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. As for the metafiction element, we never see the stories that Frog and Toad were reading, but we see the effect. Fiction moves us to be bold, moves us to try things, to change our lives. In our next story, The Corner, originally from Frog and Toad All Year, our heroes get caught in the rain and run back to Toad's house to dry. As they wait out the storm, Frog begins telling a story as follows. "When I was small, not much bigger than a tadpole," said Frog, "my father said to me, 'Son, this is a cold, gray day, but spring is just around the corner.' I wanted spring to come. I went out to find that corner. I walked down a path in the woods until I came to a corner. I went around the corner to see if spring was on the other side." "And was it?" asked Toad. "No," said Frog. "There was only a pine tree, 3 pebbles, and some dry grass." This happens 2 more times. Frog walks around 2 more corners, fails to find spring, and gets hit with rain. But Frog continues. I went back home. When I got there, said Frog, I found another corner. It was the corner of my house. Did you go around it? Asked Toad. I went around that corner too, said Frog. What did you see? Asked Toad. I saw the sun coming out, said Frog. I saw the birds sitting and singing in the tree. I saw my mother and father working in their garden. I saw flowers in the garden. You found it, cried Toad. Yes, said Frog. I was very happy. I had found the corner that spring was just around. Look, Frog, said Toad. You were right, the rain has stopped. Frog and Toad hurried outside. They ran around the corner of Frog's house to make sure that spring had come again. And that's where the story ends. The story leaves us to picture what happens next, and I love that. That sort of ending is especially potent for younger readers, in my opinion. Children have so much imagination. I love when they're confronted with a non-ending. Some of my favorite assignments from kindergarten all the way up till college asked me to imagine an alternate ending or a continuation of a story we'd read. In this story, there are really only 2 possibilities. Either Frog and Toad find spring right around the corner, or they don't. But whether they do or don't, what happens next is equally interesting. If spring is there, how do they respond? If spring isn't there, do they go looking for it? The story that Frog tells might have had a definitive ending, but the story that Lobel tells doesn't, and there's real value in that. It reminds me of this quote from flash fiction author Jane Ann Phillips. The great one-page fiction is intensely compressed, every line weighted precisely, every image firing on multiple levels. That limitless quality could be said to apply to great fiction of any length, but the realized one-page fiction must move palpably beyond the page, like a ghost self. The words of the last line should create a silence, a white space in which the reader breathes. The story enters that breath and continues. In a way, the Frog and Toad stories are sort of flash fiction, and a lot of them have this exact quality that Phillips describes, this continual nature despite the story's supposed end. In fact, I was surprised by just how many of these stories subverted my expectations and lived on after their ending. But I'm getting ahead of myself, we'll touch more on that later. One last story with a metafiction angle is this one, Shivers, originally featured in Days with Frog and Toad. The night was cold and dark. Listen to the wind howling in the trees, said Frog. What a fine time for a ghost story. Toad moved deeper into his chair. Toad, asked Frog, don't you like to be scared? Don't you like to feel the shivers? I am not too sure, said Toad. Frog made a fresh pot of tea. He sat down and began a story. When I was small, said Frog, my mother and father and I went out for a picnic. On the way home, we lost our way. My mother was worried. We must get home, she said. We do not want to meet the old dark frog. Who is that? I asked. A terrible ghost, said my father. He comes out at night and eats little frog children for supper. Toad sipped his tea. Frog, he asked, are you making this up? Maybe yes and maybe no, said Frog. My mother and father went to search for a path, said Frog. They told me to wait until they came back. I sat under a tree and waited. The woods became dark. I was afraid. Then I saw 2 huge eyes. It was the old dark frog. He was standing near me. Frog, asked Toad, did this really happen? Maybe it did and maybe it didn't, said Frog. Frog went on with the story. The dark frog pulled a skipping rope out of his pocket. I am not hungry now, said the dark frog. I have eaten too many tasty frog children, but after I've skipped rope 100 times, I will be hungry again. Then I will eat you. The dark frog tied one end of the rope to a tree. Turn for me, he shouted. I turned the rope for the dark frog. He jumped 20 times. I am beginning to get hungry, said the dark frog. He jumped 50 times. I am getting hungrier, said the dark frog. He jumped 90 times. I am very hungry now, said the dark frog. What happened then? Asked Toad. I had to save my life, said Frog. I ran around and around the tree with the rope. I tied up the old dark frog. He roared and screamed. I ran away fast. I found my mother and father, said Frog. We came safely home. Frog, asked Toad. Was that a true story? Maybe it was and maybe it wasn't, said Frog. Frog and Toad sat close by the fire. They were scared. The teacups shook in their hands. They were having the shivers. It was a good, warm feeling. This one fascinates me for so many reasons. For one thing, the vibe is very different here. Where other Frog and Toad stories might have some frightening elements, they're generally very lighthearted. This one, however, is pretty overtly spooky. It's probably not more than a child could handle, but they would almost certainly notice the difference. In fact, it's kind of funny just how much uncanniness there is in children's literature, and we've pointed that out with almost every book we've revisited on this channel. As many of you viewers have pointed out before, kids' minds can be kind of twisted in trying to make sense of the world, and I think children's authors recognize and play into that. What's also interesting is Frog's apparent unwillingness to say whether the story is true or not. What's his motive there? Perhaps the story is true, but he doesn't want to scare Toad beyond what he can take. Or perhaps the story isn't true, but Frog knows that confirming the fiction won't create the intended effect within Toad. And let's talk about the intended effect, the titular shivers. This is one of those subversive endings I was talking about. Look at the story's last two lines again. They were having the shivers. It was a good, warm feeling. Even on its face, those two lines seem totally contradictory. We almost exclusively associate the word shivers with cold, and yet there's a warm, comforting feeling in experiencing the shivers, just as Frog claims at the story's beginning. We've talked about this before, perhaps most notably in the Where the Wild Things Are video, but fiction is a great place to explore complicated feelings like fear. There's a catharsis, an adrenaline even, that comes with experiencing difficult things in the world of fiction. That's exactly why there are people like me, people who love horror even though it scares the crap out of them. I mentioned that as a kid, I was pretty much scared of everything. I still get really scared, but that fear evolved into fascination the older I got. Even as a teenager, I often sought out scary stories despite knowing how scared they would make me. The same is true today. I still engage with spooky material because there is a good, warm feeling when engaging with fiction like that. Alright, we just spent a lot of time on metafiction. Let's move on to our next big idea, selflessness. The Frog and Toad story titled A Lost Button is the story I remember best from my youth. In it, Toad loses a button from his jacket, and the entire story sees our heroes retracing their steps to look for it. They find multiple buttons, but none of them are Toad's. Eventually, Toad has a little tantrum. The text explains, "He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, 'The whole world is covered with buttons and not one of them is mine.' Toad ran home and slammed the door. There, on the floor, he saw his white, four-holed, big, round, thick button. 'Oh,' said Toad. 'It was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog.' Toad makes amends by sewing all the buttons onto his jacket and giving it to Frog the next day. To start, I'll point out that Toad's tantrum is extremely relatable. I think his words resonate. The whole world is covered with buttons, and not one of them is mine. We can apply that to all sorts of facets in life. For example, the whole world is full of jobs, but not one of them is for me. Or the whole world is full of potential partners, but not one of them is mine. Sometimes it feels like life is an endless search for something that simply can't be found. The solution, of course, is to focus less on oneself and more on others. As much as we want to find a button for ourselves, giving our buttons away is what creates true fulfillment. In that sense, we can read the story as a metaphor for sharing one's passions. Toad loved his button, and he found it in himself to give every single button away. The story might also more literally be a metaphor for charity and giving to those without. With that in mind, let's take a look at our next story, The Dream. Toad was asleep, and he was having a dream. He was on a stage, and he was wearing a costume. Toad looked out into the dark. Frog was sitting in the theater. A strange voice from far away said, "Presenting the greatest Toad in all the world." Toad took a deep bow. Frog looked smaller as he shouted, "Hooray for Toad!" "Toad will now play the piano very well," said the strange voice. Toad played the piano, and he did not miss a note. "Frog," cried Toad, "can you play the piano like this?" "No," said Frog. It seemed to Toad that Frog looked even smaller. "Toad will now walk on a high wire, and he will not fall down," said the voice. Toad walked on the high wire. "Frog," cried Toad, "can you do tricks like this?" "No," peeped Frog, who looked very, very small. "Toad will now dance, and he will be wonderful," said the voice. "Frog, can you be as wonderful as this?" said Toad as he danced all over the stage. There was no answer. Toad looked out into the theater. Frog was so small that he could not be seen or heard. "Frog," said Toad, "where are you?" There was still no answer. "Frog, what have I done?" cried Toad. Then the voice said, "The greatest Toad will now—" "Shut up!" screamed Toad. "Frog, Frog, where have you gone?" Toad was spinning in the dark. "Come back, Frog," he shouted. "I will be lonely." "I am right here," said Frog. Frog was standing near Toad's bed. "Wake up, Toad," he said. "Frog, is that really you?" said Toad. "Of course it is me," said Frog. "And are you your own right size?" asked Toad. "Yes, I think so," said Frog. Toad looked at the sunshine coming through the window. "Frog," he said, "I am so glad that you came over." "I always do," said Frog. Then Frog and Toad ate a big breakfast, and after that, they spent a fine long day together. When I finished this story, I couldn't help but feel it was a metaphor for hanging on to friendships as we age. It seems the older we get, the busier we get. It's not self-centeredness necessarily, just taking care of our individual needs. But that focus on our own lives makes everything else incidentally seem so much smaller. And let me emphasize, I really don't think there was any maliciousness here on Toad's part. I really don't think he meant to denigrate Frog, even if that is what happened. I think he just wanted to share some of the things that made him happy. Granted, on a subconscious level, there is a bit of haughtiness going on here, isn't there? His dream presents him as the greatest Toad in all the world. Luckily, Toad realizes that Frog is more important than his greatness. There's a lesson here for audiences of all ages, a lesson about friendship and the importance of give and take. It's wonderful to share things with our friends, but we need to make sure we listen when they share with us too. I'll also note that Frog was a very good audience member, but that still didn't justify Toad's actions. Toad didn't even notice that Frog was shrinking after all, until it was too late. After Toad woke up from the dream, the two of them, notably, spent the day together. That takes us to our last story on selflessness, called The Surprise. I'll just summarize this one briefly. In this story, Frog and Toad both decide to rake each other's leaves. They leave at just the right time and never cross paths, raking each one's leaves while the other is out doing the same. But as each one makes their way home, a gust of wind undoes all their work. They both come home to find their leaves undone, just as expected. The story then reads, "That night, Frog and Toad were both happy when they each turned out the light and went to bed." This is another one of those endings that subverts my expectations. I feel like a lesser, more predictable children's book would outwardly reward protagonists for their kind deeds. But this book doesn't do that, and that's interesting. What exactly is the lesson here for a child? It's a funny ending because it feels like it doesn't amount to anything. It almost feels like a non-story, the way things end exactly the way they started, with two piles of leaves left undone. But funnily enough, the story is extremely true to life. Oftentimes, our gestures go unnoticed, or they don't always amount to much, if anything. Sometimes our kindness seems entirely futile, but even when that's the case, our kindness isn't truly for nothing. Even though it seems like nothing happens in this story, there is an observable change and conclusion. I'm sure you noticed it. Frog and Toad both go to bed happy. Even though outward circumstances didn't change, the two protagonists were still met with an internal change, and that's just good writing. The lesson then is that there's happiness in selfless service, even if that service seems futile. With that, let's move on to our last big idea, insecurity. We'll start with this story, a swim. Toad and Frog went down to the river. "What a day for a swim," said Frog. "Yes," said Toad. "I will go behind these rocks and put on my bathing suit." "I don't wear a bathing suit," said Frog. "Well, I do," said Toad. "After I put on my bathing suit, you must not look at me until I get into the water." "Why not?" asked Frog. "Because I look funny in my bathing suit, that is why," said Toad. Frog closed his eyes when Toad came out from behind the rocks. Toad was wearing his bathing suit. "Don't peek," he said. Frog and Toad jumped into the water. They swam all afternoon. Frog swam fast and made big splashes. Toad swam slowly and made smaller splashes. A turtle came along the riverbank. "Frog, tell that turtle to go away," said Toad. "I do not want him to see me in my bathing suit when I come out of the river." Frog swam over to the turtle. "Turtle," said Frog, "you will have to go away." "Why should I?" asked the turtle. "Because Toad thinks that he looks funny in his bathing suit, and he does not want you to see him," said Frog. Some lizards were sitting nearby. "Does Toad really look funny in his bathing suit?" they asked. A snake crawled out of the grass. "If Toad looks funny in his bathing suit," said the snake, "then I for one want to see him." "We want to see him too," said 2 dragonflies. "Me too," said a field mouse. "I have not seen anything funny in a long time." Frog swam back to Toad. "I am sorry, Toad," he said. "Everyone wants to see how you will look." "Then I will stay right here until they go away," said Toad. The turtle and the lizards and the snake and the dragonflies and the field mouse all sat on the river bank. They waited for Toad to come out of the water. "Please," cried Frog, "please go away." But no one went away. Toad was getting colder and colder. He was beginning to shiver and sneeze. "I will have to come out of the water," said Toad. "I am catching a cold." Toad climbed out of the river. The water dripped out of his bathing suit and down onto his feet. The turtle laughed. The lizards laughed. The snake laughed. The field mouse laughed. And Frog laughed. "What are you laughing at, Frog?" said Toad. "I am laughing at you, Toad," said Frog, "because you do look funny in your bathing suit." "Of course I do," said Toad. Then he picked up his clothes and went home. Again, we have another story that surprises me with its ending. Just based on children's media I've consumed before, I figured that Frog and Toad would have a bit of a falling out here, that Frog would hurt Toad's feelings by laughing and would later apologize. But the story doesn't end that way at all. Toad responds in a way I couldn't have expected. The unexpected ending leaves the story on kind of an odd note. As far as we can tell, Toad walks away with all the confidence in the world. As a reader, I kind of have to wonder where that confidence came from. Granted, Toad said from the very beginning that he knew he looked silly, so maybe it wasn't that hard to own it as a result. Like I said, just based on other children's media, it's easy to imagine an ending to this story where Toad runs off crying and everyone eventually apologizes to him. But things don't end that way at all. It kind of reminds me of School of Rock, one of my favorite movies of all time. In one scene, Jack Black's character Dewey Finn speaks with a student, Tamika, played by Mariam Hassan. In this scene, Tamika expresses her anxiety about being a performer because she's fat. Very notably, Dewey does not try to reassure her that she's not fat. Instead, he says that people can be fat and beautiful at the same time, and more important than Tamika's body is her talent. The body positivity in this scene has always stuck out to me, especially for a movie that came out in 2003. A Swim is similar because the story doesn't try to reassure Toad in his looks. The story tells us very plainly that Toad does indeed look silly in his bathing suit, but in the end he simply owns it. This story especially resonates with me as someone who's always faced body image issues. Even as a kid, I also felt insecure about wearing a swimsuit. I think there's a great message here for kids, that it's okay to look silly and that we shouldn't let our looks bother us. Easier said than done, of course, but it's still a strong, necessary message. Toad's insecurity manifests in other ways too, particularly in his relationship with other people. In one story called The Letter, Toad explains that he waits in front of his mailbox every day even though he knows that nobody has written anything to him. There's a kind of funniness in that relatability, like Toad knows waiting for the mail will only make him sad, and yet he waits for the mail every single day. He even says, "This is my sad time of day." There's something very human about intentionally wallowing in sadness, even though it's self-destructive. But I think we've all experienced that same sort of depression when missing out on person-to-person communication. Again, Toad's anxiety is very relatable. Haven't we all feared at least once that no one likes us, that we don't have any friends? This anxiety is more realized than ever in the story called Alone. Toad went to Frog's house. He found a note on the door. The note said, "Dear Toad, I am not at home. I went out. I want to be alone." "Alone?" said Toad. "Frog has me for a friend. Why does he want to be alone?" Toad looked through the windows. He looked in the garden. He did not see Frog. Toad went to the woods. Frog was not there. He went to the meadow. Frog was not there. Toad went down to the river. There was Frog. He was sitting on an island by himself. "Poor Frog," said Toad. "He must be very sad. I will cheer him up." Toad ran home. He made sandwiches. He made a jug of iced tea. He put everything in a basket. Toad hurried back to the river. "Frog," he shouted, "it's me. It's your best friend Toad." Frog was too far away to hear. Toad took off his jacket and waved it like a flag. Frog was too far away to see. Toad shouted and waved, but it was no use. Frog sat on the island. He did not see or hear Toad. A turtle swam by. Toad climbed on the turtle's back. "Turtle," said Toad, "carry me to the island. Frog is there. He wants to be alone." "If Frog wants to be alone," said the turtle, "why don't you leave him alone?" Maybe you are right, said Toad. Maybe Frog does not want to see me. Maybe he does not want me to be his friend anymore. Yes, maybe, said the turtle as he swam to the island. Frog, cried Toad, I am sorry for all the foolish things I do. I am sorry for all the silly things I say. Please be my friend again. Toad slipped off the turtle. With a splash, he fell in the river. Frog pulled Toad up onto the island. Toad looked in the basket. The sandwiches were wet. The pitcher of iced tea was empty. Our lunch is spoiled, said Toad. I made it for you, Frog, so that you would be happy. But Toad, said Frog, I am happy. I am very happy. This morning when I woke up, I felt good because the sun was shining. I felt good because I was a frog. And I felt good because I have you for a friend. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to think about how wonderful everything is. Oh, said Toad. I suppose that is a very good reason for wanting to be alone. Now, said Frog, I will be glad not to be alone. Let's eat lunch. Frog and Toad stayed on the island all afternoon. They ate wet sandwiches without iced tea. They were two close friends sitting alone together. Toad's catastrophizing is so relatable. Haven't we all been in a position where we feared about the status of our friendship or relationship simply because we didn't receive a response for a little while? This story is also extremely unique because, up until this point, almost all the tales emphasize the importance of togetherness and selflessness. But this story tells us that it's okay to be alone for a while, to spend a moment or two on ourselves. Frog is taking some time for himself, and that's okay. It's possible to interpret his actions as selfish or contrary to the lessons we see in other stories, but I don't really think the text supports that reading, right? Frog is never condemned for wanting some time to himself. Toad is very understanding once he realizes what's going on. What's more, the turtle tried to dissuade Toad from interrupting Frog, offering him some sound advice. Sometimes people want to be left alone, need to be left alone, in fact, but that's not a bad thing. I'm not gonna lie, this story had me pretty emotional when I finished it. Frog's little speech at the end just kind of blows me away. It's so simple but so powerful. To get a bit vulnerable for a moment, I've mentioned that I struggled with fear and body image issues and struggles of masculinity since I was young. I've also experienced a lot of self-loathing in my time alive. So this moment really impresses me, specifically when Frog says, I felt good because I was a frog. That just hits me hard. To wake up and feel good being you. It's exactly what I mean when I say these characters are aspirational. So, we've taken a look at some of Frog and Toad's most interesting tales. It's honestly regrettable that I don't have time to touch on all of them. Even the ones I didn't have a lot of notes on were still so charming and thought-provoking, honestly. But there is one more thing I want to discuss, something I never considered as a kid. Are Frog and Toad in a romantic relationship? Now, why would I think that? Well, frankly, why wouldn't I think that? The two seem to spend nearly every single day together. As we've seen in these stories, there's a tenderness between them. In a story called Down the Hill, we see Frog helping Toad into his winter clothes, and it's a tender, sweet moment that's easy to read with a romantic subtext. And I'm of course not the first one to posit this question, but there's another reason for the question. As it turns out, Arnold Lobel, the author of these beloved tales, was himself a gay man. Funnily enough, Lobel has a lot in common with another one of our beloved authors on the channel, Maurice Ravel, a children's author and illustrator who is also a gay Jewish man. As we know, authors can't help from inserting themselves in their work. That said, authors can also create whatever sorts of characters they want. Lobel obviously wasn't a frog or a toad, yet he still wrote them as his protagonists. So, are Frog and Toad gay? Did the chemicals in the water really turn the freaking frogs gay? Like I said, I'm not the first person to posit this question. There's actually a bit of literature and online buzz already about the relationship between Frog and Toad. For example, when the stories were adapted for an Apple TV series, Them put out an article by Abby Montiel titled Everyone's Favorite Queer Couple, Frog and Toad, Are Coming to TV. Similarly, there's a lovely Vox article by Serena Touros titled How Frog and Toad Became Queer Anti-Capitalist Cottagecore Icons. In this article, author Asha Tanki says, I don't think I grew up reading Frog and Toad as incredibly queer-coded because I didn't grow up knowing queer adults in my life. And I can say for sure that my experience was the same. Tanki further told Vox, as I learned more about me, but also saw more queer adults, I think then you start to be like, oh, that's exactly what it could look like. Tanki also notes the intimate knowledge that Frog and Toad share between themselves. As Touros wrote, Frog and Toad are models of lifelong partnership. But the most significant piece is a 2016 New Yorker article by Colin Stokes titled Frog and Toad, an Amphibious Celebration of Same-Sex Love. In this article, Stokes interviews Arnold Lobel's daughter, Adrienne Lobel. Adrienne noted the romantic subtext in Frog and Toad and how that subtext resonates with kids. She explains, I've watched children grow up, and that whole drama that's kind of the precursor to the hell of romance later in life, who is best friends with whom and who likes who when, and this person doesn't like me now. It's very painful, and I think that children really like to hear that this is not abnormal, that Frog and Toad go through these dramas every day. Adrienne also called the series ahead of its time for featuring two same-sex leads who loved each other, even if that love was not explicitly romantic. It was 1974 when Arnold came out to his family, 4 years after the first Frog and Toad book was published. Adrienne recalls, I think Frog and Toad really was the beginning of him coming out. Of course, none of that really answers the question of whether Frog and Toad are gay. If the question is whether Arnold Lobel intended to portray them as gay characters, well, we'll never really know for sure. But as I've said before on this channel, authorial intent isn't everything. We can take Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street as another example. The folks at Sesame Workshop have repeatedly maintained that Bert and Ernie are not in a romantic relationship. Still, fans love to interpret their relationship as such. When the discussion around Bert and Ernie sort of popped off online in 2018, Frank Oz tweeted, why the need to define people as only gay? There's much more to a human being than straightness or gayness. And sure, that's at least somewhat true. Whether we read Frog and Toad as gay or not, one thing's for sure. Lobel depicted a positive relationship between two men, which is valuable regardless of whether or not they're gay. However, regarding Frank Oz's initial response, several queer people wrote to him and explained why Bert and Ernie meant so much to them. He later tweeted, if Jim Henson and I had created Bert and Ernie as gay characters, they would be inauthentic coming from two straight men. However, I have now learned that many view them as representative of a loving gay relationship, and that's pretty wonderful. Thanks for helping me understand. If you read Frog and Toad as gay characters, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I'd say it's pretty wonderful. One thing is clear, they absolutely do love each other. There's honestly so much more we could say about these books, so much that I haven't said or haven't even thought to say. There's a reason that we continue reading these stories to our children today. What do you think of the Frog and Toad books? What do you think about them now compared to as a child? Please tell me everything. And seeing as there's so much to say about these stories, I decided I'd upload a little unscripted, unedited Patreon video to read and discuss the stories I didn't include in this video. You can check that out for as little as $3. Joining the Patreon also gets you early access to future videos, membership on the community Discord, and priority review for your work over on the second channel. Subscribe over there for some writing tips. You're seeing the names of my patrons scrolling across the screen right now. I want to take this moment to thank them so much for their support. If you want to support me in other ways, you can do all the things the algorithm likes, and you can follow me on my socials. That's all for now, and keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft. Also, I've let my hair get longer than it's been in years, and frankly, I'm not sure what to do with it. I don't know if I want to cut it or not. So, any advice would be appreciated. Thanks.